Welcome back to What You Will Learn. My name is Adam Ashton.
And my name is Adam Jones. Today we're taking you through the best bits of The Sovereign Individual by James Dale Davidson and Lord William Rees-Mogg. Did you put in Lord or did he put in Lord?
That's his.
He put in Lord.
He's a lord. I don't know what it takes to become a lord, but he is a lord.
Well, we'll find out because it must be a sovereign individual thing. But the sub-kicker is mastering the transition to the informational age. Can't believe he named himself Lord, but we'll go with it.
Through all of human history, from the start till now, there's just been three big stages of economic life. There was hunter-gatherer societies, then there was agricultural societies, then there was industrial societies. And now what they're saying is just around the corner, we're coming into informational societies. And we should probably say this was written 26 years ago, 1997. And so they we're in the transition between industrial and informational.
That's right. And they're not the types who predict quick flash-in-the-pan predictions. They're the types who pick huge shifts and huge trends. So 25 years into it, we could sort of make a judgment on how well they've gone up until this point as we go through the episode. Because right now, we're in a situation that has striking parallels in the past. We can make a big analogy from previous shifts in history. Probably a huge one is in the 15th century when really life had become saturated by organised religion, and pretty much today everything's just saturated with politics.
Looking back to history, we know what happened at the end of sort of the era that was dominated by the church once the gunpowder revolution came across. And drawing some parallels to today, we can kind of see what may be coming around the corner. Or as these blokes saw 25 years ago, they're probably ticking off a few of their predictions so far pretty well.
Yeah, they are. So what this book does, it explores the social and financial consequences of the revolutionary change we're about to go through today. And really, in one sense, they say they want to really help you take advantage of the opportunities of the new age, but I think that's a big ask. I think, well, as we'll find out, they're pretty big changes for you to just surf a wave. It's like a tidal wave coming, and they're telling you to just get the surfboard out there and just jump on it and catch it and go to the Cayman Islands or whatnot. It's a bit harder than that, but at least we're going to learn about this tidal wave that's going to just wipe you out.
They're saying that the Industrial Revolution, so the previous change that we went through, the last one, was saying it was spread over centuries. It was locally sort of driven. There were certain areas where it happened quicker than others, and others were a bit slow to catch up, and some never caught up. But they're saying now, this time, this transition is going to pretty much happen everywhere all at once, and there's no avoiding it. So you want to grab that surfboard and jump on the tidal wave, otherwise you'll be underwater.
To see outside an existing system is like being a stagehand trying to force a dialogue with a character in play. They're just in the middle of a play and you're just going to try and interrupt them. Sort of just breaches the convention entirely and just doesn't keep that system of the play functioning.
Who's the outsider and who's the insider in this metaphor?
I think the people are just going along in their play and then someone can't really just interrupt them.
Gotcha. So if you're in the play and someone's off to the side, so they're saying they're the stagehand off to the side trying to talk to you, and you're in the play.
Yeah,
okay,
that's
That's where we are. We're all in our play. There's a couple of people like the Lord Mogg Rees or whatever his name is. The Lord is off to the side trying to give us a few words, but we're just playing our play at the moment.
That's right.
It's hard to break out of that.
And that's because the more apparent that a system is nearing its end, the more reluctant people are going to be to adhere to its laws. So if we said this, hey, this society, this tidal wave's coming, no one's going to just adhere to the laws. You just start breaking the law. I did a little bit of that during COVID. Started going through red lights all the time. It was like, fuck it. And that sort of things will start happening probably at a much grander scale as well.
What's the statute of limitations on that?
What's that?
on the running red lights. Can they retroactively just go, Oh, Jonesy, you ran a couple of red lights back in 2020. Yeah. Here's a fine.
Yeah, no, I don't think they can, mate. I think we're done. And this is pretty similar to what happened during the Roman Empire because it was probably the biggest historical development in the first millennia, especially in the Christian era. But long after the demise, there was still a fiction that the Roman Empire is still together. Everyone's just going along in the play when everything was just going down in a pretty steady collapse. But the people figured out the Roman Empire had collapsed after it actually mattered.
That's right. It's a strange one, isn't it? He's saying that to use a bit of a metaphor, if it was today, I don't know, say the US government completely collapsed, you're not going to see on CNN, you're not going to see on the news, the government is collapsed today. It just doesn't happen like that. So thinking back then, no one knew that Rome had collapsed. Everyone thought everything was just ticking along hunky-dory and everyone was kind of just in that play and everything was ticking along. And really, it was done.
Well, everyone had a vested interest of just going along with the play, right? Like the CNN today, they got a vested interest. They're not going to undermine the things that sort of hold together their own profits, which is the system. And it's really only people with strong character and strong opinions would actually get to the point of dare contradicting it. This is our old mate, Lord. The Lord, man, he can do it. And he's doing it in a very good way, I think.
And that example of Rome is pretty relevant today for a number of reasons. As we're looking at the conditions of the world today, most books about the future are really books about the present. But what the authors are doing here is they're making a book about the future by making a book about the past. Does that make sense?
It does. Well, there's a lot more. If you're looking at the past, and there's analogies of, and what they have is the mega political points, mega political forces, and a weird term here, the logic of violence is really what shapes everything in the past. It's a weird, very weird premise to say the logic of violence is really what shapes the past, but they make a pretty good case of it in the coming sections.
Yeah, I'll back that you're going to learn more about the future from the past than from the present.
Yeah.
So I'll back that, yeah. This logic of violence that you speak about, logic of violence. Violence sounds pretty illogical, but actually, no, it's very, very logical.
It's very logical. If someone's got a gun, it's like, yeah, you better to be feared than loved. A bit of Machiavellian sort of spin on it, but it's very true.
As we sort of evolved into agricultural societies, if you think about it, if you've got a couple of sheep, a couple of goats, if you've got a plot of land, maybe you want to get a bit more land, you sure as hell don't want somebody else coming and taking your land. You don't want them to take your land. You don't want them to take your herds. You don't want them to take your crops. How are you going to stop them from doing that?
Exactly. And that protection of resources is what they say is the logic of violence. Whoever can actually beat the other person is take what they've got is the winner. And in this sense, what it meant back then is didn't really make sense to go out and learn to become Jackie Chan when you're an agricultural society. We're all pretty similar in size and stature. When it comes down to it, who's going to win in a war is actually at that stage, it's just going to be about who's got the most people.
That's right.
Going into a fisticuffs fight.
That's right. If you're just growing your potatoes and you think you just want to learn all the skills that you can, get all the weapons you can to protect your potatoes, if 10 blokes come around the corner, they're probably going to take your potatoes. So it's better to join the big group, to have a big group, a bigger sort of army to protect everybody's communal land and sort of all work together.
So in response to this, what happened, and of course we've been through history a fair bit, a few other things going on back then, but the Roman Empire did come in response to this. So if you're a peasant with a local farm, you basically pay peasant insurance to the local landlord and who would be the Roman Empire at the time. So that's where the idea of taxes came in to actually start paying for public goods. And it gave a really good, kept the peace really in the area so people didn't go to war. And, the Roman Empire eventually is going to kick the ass of anyone else in the area, like your barbarians and whatnot.
That's right. So you, as your farmer, you pay a little bit of your profits over to the government or, the equivalent of the government. They organise a bit of the army and they collectively protect all of the farmers together. So you're effectively paying indirectly for the protection, yeah?
Yeah. But as is the case with every new centralised sort of command that comes through, the Romans, they started, having a little bit of extra ham and with their dinner of the overlords and a bit of that extra wine and maybe build an extra little mansion over there and a little castle over here. And
that's all for your protection, though.
All for your protection there. And of course, that's what happens. And there's a lot more corruption and the amount of taxes for it increases over time and gets to the point where it all gets senile quite to the extreme. And that's really what happened with the Roman Empire. They overextended themselves from that and then to the point where it obviously collapsed.
Yeah, if previously you were paying a small portion and you were getting protection in return, all of a sudden some of that money is being used for other things and then the money that they want from you is going up and up and up. The return on that is really getting really eroded. You're paying a hell of a lot more, you're getting a hell of a lot less, and eventually there's a tipping point where you think, no, we can't do this anymore.
So in the first few centuries after the fall of Rome, the economy of Western Europe started to wither a little bit. Your infrastructure that obviously previously had centralized command, it started to wither and centuries passed and the aqueducts started to fall and become unusable and your land markets, which had thrived under the Roman Empire, began to dry up. And in terms of education, literacy didn't go higher, metallurgy receded. So there was a few things that actually went downhill because of the fall of the Roman Empire.
A weird thing, though, that all these markers seem to be going backwards. Strangely, though, the individual living standards of, say, the small farmers, they actually increased over the next couple of 100 years. And the reason was, even though these things all got a little bit worse, they weren't paying those massive exorbitant taxes anymore. So on net, they actually kind of won out of the collapse of Rome.
Yeah, on net, eh? But so what happened from this point is the next new logic of violence evolved, and this was the idea of heavy cavalry. So previously, it doesn't matter if you're Jackie Chan, as long as you got 10 it all comes down to the volume of people you've got. But now, if someone's got a heavy cavalry, if you think back to guns, germs, and steel, one heavy cavalry with swords and armor and everything like that, they could take down 10s or up to 100 per unit. So now it came down to who's actually can afford the heavy cavalry, and they'll have a disproportionate amount of resources go to them. It's a bit like a late 10th century Blade Runner, and what emerged out of this was actually little castles and kingdoms. So little groups of people would actually try to protect themselves and have their own group of knights to protect them. And that's really what emerged out of this as a way of protecting people's assets. And obviously from here, the people in the castle started paying their tax to a centralized authority.
So that centralized authority that pops up after the collapse of the Roman Empire, now the church pops up and became this centralized command. So in an era here where the military power was kind of decentralized, the church was uniquely placed to maintain the peace and develop the rules and a bit of order that transcended those fragmented local sovereignties. The church, they also were important for spreading technical knowledge and information. They sponsored universities, they produced books and manuscripts. They also took a role in helping farm managers who were becoming more literate. They helped them become a great deal more productive, so they increased the productivity of European farming. They undertook many of the functions that today have since been absorbed by government, including the provision of public infrastructure. And they also helped incubate a more complex market where they constructed and helped sort of deepen markets for many artisanal specialties and also engineering skills.
So like every centralized authority, eventually things change, and then new forces causes these change, and we end up living in a different world. So as you were saying there, Ashto, the church did a few things which were pretty good, but they did a few things that were pretty bad as well. When they start getting a bit ahead of themselves and not just doing the good things, they start making more bad than good. One of them being monopoly pricing, a bit like the nation state today. They really started regulating specific industries to underpin their own interests and use their regulatory powers just to gain revenue that directs it in a certain way. They started doing really weird shit, and they started just like asking for money for everything. So your local priests, all of a sudden, there's this new rule. The priest, you can go out and have a root, you can go out and have sex if you just give us a bit of cash.
Yeah, they said that you're not allowed to have sex within a marriage on Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays, or 40 days before Easter, or 40 days before Christmas for that whole period. But there was a catch. If you wanted to, if you thought in that 40-day period you got a little bit frisky, okay, you can break the church's rules, but you got to cough up a bit of cash in order to do that.
And like obviously indulgences in any sort of sin. You can go out there and do something. You can do some pretty bad shit out there as long as you just pay us. Just do what you want, basically, except for as long as you pay us.
That's right. It's only to cross a bit of a blurred line there from, the church meant to be maintaining the good and, repelling evil and sin, but you're allowed to do some bad shit as long as you send a bit of coin back.
So another one here is like the bureaucratic overlords. So you had more and more priests, you had more and more bureaucracy in it and the way things work. So they actually attract more and more cash to this centralized authority, and, incapable of sustaining themselves at really any sort of revenue. Every year they sort of need more and more revenue to actually just keep this thing going.
There also seemed to be a bit of a diversion of the flow of funds.
It's one way of putting it.
The taxes were getting higher and higher, or the equivalent of taxes. And the church initially was meant to be used for all these public goods, all these good things to support everybody. Like we said, the universities and helping improve productivity of crops and all this stuff. But now all of a sudden there's a few sort of general overhead expenses. As the church grows larger, they need to sort of pay to keep the lights on, metaphorically.
Oh, yeah. And literacy, probably literally for, you got Pope Alexander here, who probably had a cardinal. So one cardinal, he staged a famous orgy in Siena with the most, beautiful women of the whole city he'd invited. So, and even the brothers and the fathers and husbands, of course, they couldn't.
They didn't get the invite.
Didn't get the invite. And servants kept score of each man's orgasm. There you go. And the Pope admired this great vitality. So if you're paying taxes and why not get invited to this Pope's party?
Yeah.
If you're a young, single, horny man, especially.
Yeah, well, all the cardinals that popped off the most times were regarded as the most strong leaders.
You'd be thinking, hang on, what's going on here? Probably a bit similar to us today.
In what sense?
As in what's going on
we'd be
here?
confused.
Well, with some of the government spending, you could say,
Yeah.
So really what the reasons the church came into existence at the start, they did all this good shit. Then they started doing all this bad shit.
Yep.
They got ahead of themselves. And then a new mega political force came in, and this was the gunpowder revolution. So remember, the church came out of knights, and that was the initial spark of it. The gunpowder revolution went back to the old peasant days where all it came down to, you think about the First World War, who's got the most soldiers, who's got the most guns, who run up against each other, and bang, 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 and whoever's got more people wins. So it went back to that. And that's really where, after the church demise, something new came in its place, and that was the nation state today. So previously, what we think of as being an Australian citizen or US citizen or Nicaragua or wherever the hell you might be from, that's who we see as our centralized identity today. Back then, it was all about being under the church. The church wasn't really, identifying with the country.
That's right. So instead of the Cardinals going bang, bang, bang in their special parties, now you've got the armies going bang, bang, bang in a different sense. We can see the returns. Violence is on the rise again. The church managed to keep things pretty civil for a couple of hundred years while they were sort of pretending to run things in the name of good. But now we can see that violence is back on the rise.
That's right. So that's what happened. The nation state came in 5 centuries ago. And this whole book's really been an analogy. Those things we were saying before, in roundabout ways, sort of happened again. The mega political force that brought in the nation state. So yeah, the nation state popped up, and the centralized bureaucracy and the amount of sort of tax and income redistribution going centralized is increasing and increasing. And it's more questionable how it perhaps is being spent than it was in the past. And we don't really see the cost. It's not always obvious. It's more of an opportunity cost, which it doesn't really actually come to top of mind, does it?
And interestingly, the costs, these new costs, they really fell most heavily upon the more ambitious and more hardworking peasants, the ones who depended more on the aristocracy upon deploying their capital usefully. They paid the most in supporting the extravagant bureaucracy. The ones that depended more on the aristocracy deploying their capital usefully, they paid the most for supporting this new extravagant bureaucracy.
So the big mega political force is the information age. What were you doing in 97, Ashto? You would have been a very young...
Yeah, I was 3 or 4.
I wouldn't even know what the internet was when I was 7. Probably most people didn't know. No. 99% of the population. So... this is very early days where he says this new information age technology is a new mega political force that's going to change everything. But that's basically what he's saying here.
Big Lord Rees, or the Lord and the Mogg, they thought, the authors here, they thought the capacity for expansion here was just, they used the word stupefying, which to me just sounds really, really wild. There's with more money being spent on communication because it was so cheap, as in the internet being able to spread information further and faster and wider than ever before. All these things where the World Wide Web is going to deliver a rich mix of signals to every computer around the world, and bandwidth is going to continue to increase and increase and increase. They're saying that this is really unlocking the potential for this next major massive shift.
He says there's going to be a world with enough graphic density, and there's a few things we'll see how he went, but enough graphic density to become the metaverse. Mm-hmm. Don't know if Zuck's who came up with that first. I think you could ask Zuck's for a few mil and coin that phrase.
I don't think this guy coined it. I think that came a few decades before.
Oh, did it?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
But the big question is, it's that protecting what? Like, in every sense, there's a point in the journey of whatever the centralized bureaucracy is. What the hell are they actually doing now? It went through every other part of the journey, and as societies become richer, whilst the total percentage taken in taxes is still rising significantly, really a question worth asking, especially for the people who are actually holding most of the goods. Yeah,
if you think, 2,000 years ago when you had a little farm, it was probably worth paying a little bit to the Roman Empire to have their army protect you. And if you think about then the church was kind of the next bit where you paid for the protection. Now you're saying that previously the government, you were paying for protection. Now it's like, well, what are we paying for? What are our taxes using? What are they protecting us from?
So the new era we're living in, and this is their words, there's going to be a more advanced stage where there's a transition to true cyber commerce. Not only transactions are going to be caused on the internet, there's actually going to be low orbit satellites who's going to transmit feeds back and forth directly to a beep in your pocket. That's a smartphone. Your phone's going to become a bank. Smartphone again. 97. Oh no, I said 97 10 times, but worth saying again. Customized media. He said that he's going to have individualized feeds, which is basically social media.
Yeah, that's another tick.
It's another tick. And perhaps the big one, which is the mega political force, is privatizing money and the new era of economics, because there's going to be a new digital form of money which allows people to become their own private firm.
Sounds like another tick to me as well. The odd Bubble or Revolution book, which was written 23 years after this one, basically said, yeah, these guys were kind of onto it. We mentioned in that Bubble or Revolution how cryptocurrencies and digital currencies are effectively a hedge against inflation, in the sense that traditional inflation is when the big governments are printing money, and that I guess the cost of everything is going up and up and up because money's flying around because there's more money in the system. Whereas for cryptocurrencies, where it's quite fixed and sometimes even deflationary because people are losing their hard drives in the tip from 10 years ago. So really the advent of this new digital currency that these guys predicted 25 years ago is saying that that's really going to eradicate inflation potentially.
Potentially, yeah. So previously, with the government had a monopoly on the currency, they could, if some issue pops up, they just print money and solve it. And they could just do that ad infinitum, but that allowed them to go in such deficits where, at the end of the day, probably the hardworking peasants are the ones paying off in the long run. But they no longer have that monopoly on currency because of this advent of cryptocurrency. So, if people can actually control their money and not allow governments to defraud them by printing it and sort of eradicating the value of money, then there's a new dilemma for Western governments around the world.
Governments are going to face sharp drops in revenue from taxation. Effectively, if you're trying to opt out of the government system, and that system is where you're paying tax, and all of a sudden they don't have control over that money, then there's going to be less people paying tax. There's going to be a hell of a lot of the rich people opting out of paying tax, and the government's going to think, hang on, how come the stream that's flowing into our big coffers seems to be getting a bit of a trickle these days?
Bit of a trickle, bit of a little whittle. And if you think about and this is playing out probably more in the US than Australia, you could say, but you hear places like California where the tax is increasing a lot in that specific place where rich people used to be, and they're like, why are we paying, we've got the power here to move ourselves, so why would I stay in California when they're raising the tax? I'm going to go to Texas where there's lower tax. So at the same time, you've got the places that are raising the tax are actually getting the least, having the greatest loss to themselves. So they're going to go towards that bankruptcy quicker than all the other places.
And that's obviously on the state to state level. If you scale that up, eventually it could be on the nation level. If you think that some countries are charging exorbitant amount of taxes and you're not really getting much benefit as a result, then you might just head to a different place that is charging a hell of a lot less tax.
That's right. So the countries and governments used to have a monopoly on things like this, but not anymore. There's going to be a bit of a competitive tendering really to have these sovereign individuals, the ones who have actually got all the cash and the disproportionate amount of wealth, then where are they going to go with it? So new places are going to pop up that actually have a better situation for them, and people are going to hate this sort of shit, hearing this sort of shit. And I totally get that, because previously the government had made a lot of sense, the deal, but for them it's it just doesn't make sense anymore. I'm going somewhere else. So this is where you're going to see the first smaller jurisdictions at the provincial level, really.
So we can see the winners of this new shift. They're going to be the rich people with all the money who get all the control, and they get to choose to go somewhere where they don't have to pay as much tax and they can do what they want. Then who are the losers then? The losers of this information age are going to be the people who are the most dependent on the government, I guess. The people that are tax consumers, they say, they're going to be the losers. The ones who are getting the welfare payments, or the ones who are most reliant on, the government fixing the potholes in the road and whatever else the government is doing for them, they're going to be the losers, because the government all of a sudden is getting less tax coming in, so there's also less spending going out.
Well, if you got a jet plane, you don't really need to worry about those peasants' potholes, do you?
That's right.
Tax consumers, that's one interesting way of labelling the people on welfare, isn't it?
I suppose you are consuming tax in a way.
So the left behinds, probably the tax, another word for these consumers, they're going to be pretty unpleasant from all this, and perhaps fair enough. But at the end of the day, they're saying citizenship is going to be a bit like chivalry back in the day. Back in the day when today we'll say I'm Australian. Back in the day, you'd say I'm chivalrous, I'm religious, I'm to this church. They're pretty similar things. They're pretty arbitrary from the perspective of history, the long arc of history. Australia is just as you think of Yuval Noah Harari's books, it's just just a flag, really. There's no real difference between us and a German or whatever. So that arbitrariness will disappear, and your sort of loyalty to your nation is going to erode as well with these forces.
And they say, well, because of this, if governments see this coming on the horizon, that the sort of allegiance to their flag is being reduced, then maybe one or maybe multiple nations might think, well, rather than having everybody spreading around so much, maybe we should take some kind of action to stop international travel, in a sense. Well, what can we do to stop people from traveling internationally? And they say, well, one way they could do that is some kind of biological warfare, like say the outbreak of a deadly pandemic that stops everybody from traveling internationally.
There you go, mate. I feel like they got into little what do you call it? Little time travel capsule. Obviously predicted the COVID pandemic there in some interpretations of how it happened. So these new mega political forces, you could say it's pretty remarkable what they've come up with. The trend of, say, government deficits, you can't really deny that. You can't deny that individuals are becoming richer and governments are trying to raise taxes. So you sort of extrapolate where that leads to 10, 20, 30 years from now. It's probably like, what do you reckon, Ashto? Pretty hard to deny that a potential outcome of bankruptcy of nation states.
Yeah, well, that's what they're saying, isn't it? They're saying that the current sort of international government system is going to go the way of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, that's a pretty big tidal wave coming. How are you going to ride it?
Get that surfboard out.
Basically, to ride this way, you just become rich, don't you?
That's what they say. It was a long 700-page book, and the kicker is read lots of books, get smart, make a business, make lots of money, and then you don't need to rely on the government, and you can just become rich and ride that tidal wave.
Yeah, become a sovereign individual. Don't rely on the government so much. Get your money, go to the Cayman Islands. They've got a whole bunch of places, and I looked up on the internet a few places you can go to if you're that way inclined. You can go to the UAE, you can go to Singapore. The Bahamas are pretty good. They've got 8.79 on this arbitrary website I got, where your property taxes are 1% and your capital gains tax. There's a few places like that are just calling out for people once you've made the journey. But yeah, got to get on that surfboard first.
So they say that the way to do this, well, they don't really give you a recipe. They just say go and read a whole bunch of other books to learn how to get good at business and make lots of money. But they do say that success in business, as in most areas in life, depends on the ability to solve problems. If you can learn or if you can teach yourself how to solve problems, you can have a pretty bright career ahead of yourself. No matter where you live, there are going to be problems that need solving. So if you can be the person who's a problem solver, you're going to be pretty well off.
So in most cases, people are going to benefit from the solutions of their problems, and they're probably going to pay you handsomely to the effect of them. And it's probably your pathway to become a sovereign individual if that's the way you want to go.